My intention was never to be antagonistic. I was honestly astounded by the response that this piece got because I felt like my intentions were good. It was a memorial for somebody that had died, and I took that very seriously. And I was very touched by a lot of what I saw at the vigil. As somebody that loves and values all people within my community, it was hard to see people be distraught over this. And obviously, there were people that cared deeply about it and expressed that to me. And so it was not my intention to hurt those people. My intention was just to provide a little context for who he was and the things that he believed in.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is former reporter for the Homer News, Chloe Pleznac. After 6 years working in public radio, Chloe got her first newspaper job at the Homer News in January of this year. After the right-wing political activist Charlie Kirk was assassinated on September 10th, the representative for Homer, Sarah Vance, co-organized a vigil for Kirk, which was held on September 17th. Chloe decided to cover that vigil for the paper and posted her online story along with video of the event to the Homer News website on Tuesday, September 23rd. Representative Vance objected to the article and wrote a letter to Carpenter Media, which owns not only the Homer News, but also the Peninsula Clarion in Kenai and the Juneau Empire. By Thursday, September 25th, Chloe's story had been taken down, rewritten, and then republished online without Chloe's byline and without any acknowledgement that the story had been changed. Neither Chloe nor her editor, Aaron Thompson, were informed the story was being taken down, edited, or republished. Ultimately, both Chloe and her editor resigned from the paper because of this incident. Joining them in their resignation was the entire staff of the Peninsula Clarion in Kenai, Jeff Helminiak and Jake Dye. Jake appeared on this podcast the day after his resignation. You will hear Chloe and I reference Jake and also Michael Armstrong, who was the former editor of the Homer News, who was also a guest on this podcast. Chloe Pleznac, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You grew up in Homer, right?
I did. Yeah, I was born and raised here in Homer. I only left once, and that was to go live in Juneau for a couple years.
Tell me about growing up in Homer. What was that like?
Oh, it was wonderful. Homer is just a beautiful little community. It's one of the best places I think you could grow up. I was born here and raised on a small farm on Diamond Ridge. I was homeschooled from an early age. The majority of my education was actually as a homeschooler. I did graduate from Homer High School my senior year, though. A lot of time reading as a homeschool student and spent a lot of time in nature. And I had a little newspaper, too, that I ran in my neighborhood and would distribute. So my love for journalism and reporting and community has always been around.
Why did your parents homeschool you?
Well, there was a lot of different reasons, but I think my mother was very concerned about gun violence because she was witness to the Columbine shootings when I was younger and some of those things. My parents came from South Lake Tahoe, where there was some kidnappings, I think most noticeably of J.C. Lee Dugard and things like that. So I think part of it had to do with wanting me to be safe and protected. But there's also a lot of accessibility that homeschooling provides families. So it wasn't for any kind of religious reason, which I think is reasoning for a lot of people, especially within Homer. It was more for safety and provide me a little bit more flexibility with how they were teaching me things. So I really appreciated that.
It sounds like if your mom was concerned about gun violence and your dad was concerned about kidnappings, I don't know if you felt overly sheltered as a child.
I did feel a little sheltered as a child, for sure. I was privileged to be able to spend a lot of time at the farmers market, so I got a lot of social interaction that way and a lot of exposure to other homeschool students, a lot of the farming community. When I was younger, most of the kids that I spent time with at the farmers market, there's about 5 or 7 of us at different times, and all of them were homeschooled as well. So there were, little homeschool sub-communities, I think. It made it a little bit easier to feel like you had community and you had exposure to other people your age that I think some people might miss in other more sheltered homeschool environments.
In Anchorage and in the Mat-Su, a lot of homeschoolers do what I would call like a hybrid model. I'm not sure what they call it, but where they actually do go to school for some things, including sports or extracurricular activities. Did you do any of that?
I did, yeah. I did classes at the high school when I reached high school age. And so I did choir and different math classes there. And so I was part-time there, but still technically under a homeschool program. I went through Connections Homeschool down here on the peninsula. And then when I reached junior year, I had a lot of interest in the college dialogue came up, what I was going to do after high school. And Homer High School is fantastic as far as advanced placement opportunities go, at least when I was in high school. And so I started to utilize those starting in junior year. And I believe by second semester of junior year, I had become a full-time student there.
Did you go to University of Alaska Southeast? Is that why you moved to Juneau?
So first I went to the Ketchimak Bay campus here in Homer, which is a division of University of Alaska Anchorage. And I graduated in 2018 and I started at Ketchimak Bay campus that same fall, so 2018. And I earned my associate's degree through them and graduated in 2020. And that was when COVID came along. And I was looking at transferring out of state, maybe somewhere in Oregon to complete my bachelorette, but everything was online at that point anyways. And distance education became a lot more accessible. And so I ended up just staying in the University of Alaska system and applying to the bachelor program through University of Alaska Anchorage. And I graduated there with a double bachelor's in political science and history. And I was able to do that just from here in Homer because of the distance education that was being instituted during the pandemic. And so I was working at the public radio station here and going to school full time and graduated in 2022. And then that August, I was offered a job at KTOO Public Media down in Juneau. And I accepted that job and also studied at UAS in their Masters of Public Administration program while I was working at KTOO. So I was down in Juneau, going to school, working at the radio station, and working on my education.
Did you finish that master's?
I did. Yeah, I graduated last December.
What was the experience like working at KTOO?
Oh, it was lovely. Yeah, I love public radio. The public radio community is just wonderful. And I feel like Alaska is really special in that it has this whole network of stations that are all collaborating and communicating and working to share news and working to support each other. And so having that early exposure here in Homer through KBBI was just wonderful. And then being able to move to our capital city and have that experience working in, I consider KTOO one of the best newsrooms in the state. And it was just a privilege and a wonderful opportunity. I really ended up missing home and Homer because I was born and raised here and very integrated into the community. And so I ended up moving back at the end of 2024, so about a year ago exactly. And yeah, moved back here and started working at the newspaper.
It was because you specifically wanted to move back to Homer. You were looking for a job in Homer, and Homer News was hiring.
Yeah, I actually moved back before even getting a job with the newspaper just because of how much I missed the community. I didn't really have any work lined up when I moved back. I just wanted to come back and find a way to serve my community. I love Homer. That's part of the reason why I went to earn my master's in public administration is because I've been very involved in nonprofit work in all different kinds of areas here and have always just approached any kind of work from a service mindset. And that's been really important to me. So I really missed home. And I also wanted to find a way to serve my community with my new education and with my experience that I felt like I'd gained in Juneau. But the news environment on the Kenai Peninsula is very limited. There's not a lot of outlets to work through. So working at the newspaper or working at KBBI were the two outlets that people have to work as reporters or editors in this community. And so I was just absolutely thrilled to have the opportunity to work with the newspaper here. And I got that call probably about 4 months after I had moved back to Homer. I had the opportunity to speak with my former editor, Aaron, about an opportunity to start there and was just really excited because I'd only really had public radio experience before that. So it was a big opportunity for me to learn this other side of reporting and this other side of the news industry and also be able to serve my community in that role. So, yeah.
Your bachelor's was in history and poli-sci. So you were a history and poli-sci major, not a journalism major. And then you got your master's in public administration. A lot of folks who ended up working as journalists got their degrees in journalism. Was it that you weren't really planning on working in journalism and it just happened?
I started working with KBBI as a volunteer when I was 16 years old. So when I was still in high school, and at the time I was just doing music shows, like volunteer music spots in the evening. But growing up in Homer, a lot of people listened to KBBI. I grew up listening to it and listening to NPR. And so it was my first exposure to both national news and local news. And so I was always very inspired and interested in getting involved in public radio. And so got my foot in the door volunteering in high school. And then when I was 18, after I had graduated and I just started my college journey at the local community campus, I was offered a position as a morning edition host at KBBI. And I think just about 4 hours every morning. But through that position, it was my first exposure to being in a newsroom and having experience working with reporters, working with managing editors, and also being integrated into that statewide Alaska Public Radio network that I was talking about. Every morning I would get there about 3:30 in the morning or 4, and I would go through my email and I'd read dozens of stories from every public radio station across the state because they all send it through this one email channel that disperses it to other radio stations. And so every morning I would go through those stories and I would get to see just everything happening in all these different communities and choose which stories I was going to run as the morning news host every morning. And I read a lot of journalism and I listened to a lot of journalism. And every day I was probably consuming about 4 hours of national news through NPR. I'd listen to Democracy Now! Every morning. And so when it came time to choose what the next steps in my education were, like I said, COVID had hit. And so everything was online at that point. And a lot of the people that I was hearing be interviewed on public radio were either historians or political scientists or lawyers or things like that. And I just was very impressed by their ability to speak to issues and their experiences and their perspectives. And I thought that most closely aligned with what I wanted to pursue in the future.
So I've heard from some folks that the world of Alaska public media and just public radio in general is its own little universe. And having moved out into the more traditional world of print journalism by going to Homer News, talk about what the transition was like from working in radio to working in print.
The biggest transition point for me, just because I had been, like I said, I started at 18. And so it was about 6 years or so that I did public radio. So when you're listening to a public radio story, I think you get a lot more maybe of intention or perspective into what the speaker is saying or what they believe, or a lot more perhaps story context. And that was a difficult thing for me to navigate, I think, is finding ways to include all of that within just a written word. So that was the biggest learning curve, I think, for me. And I only had the opportunity to do it for about 9 months. I felt like I was just starting to get a full grasp of that.
So when I interviewed Jake Dye, he talked about having to do 2 to 3 stories a day, 5 days a week. Was it a similar expectation from you?
Yes, that was the expectation handed down to us from corporate management, was that we were expected to put out 2 stories a day at least. Yeah.
And did you feel that was a heavy workload as a newer print journalist?
It was definitely daunting, and it's difficult too because you want to do a good job and you want to put out stories that are in depth and inclusive and able to address different perspectives and take your time with things and be able to just do good work. And that can be very difficult when you're expected to turn stories in that quick a fashion, especially when you're working in a community that has a lot of quickly moving issues or big issues that you want to spend time on or things like that. Thinking about an 8-hour workday, there are some stories that take a lot more than 4 hours to work on. That was difficult at times. And I feel like there were stories that I had to skip over or wasn't able to tell because of that expectation. And so that was difficult, having to navigate that within the community and work with sources and let them know that maybe I didn't have the time to do a story that I would have really liked to do or that I thought was very important just because of that time constraint.
Jake was also pretty forthright that he was making $20 an hour.
I was also being paid $20 an hour, yeah. In Juneau, I was making a lot more than that. So
you took a huge pay cut.
I took a huge pay cut. And I mean, that, again, the money for me is less important than the serving of my community. That was my main priority, but it was difficult and it was not easy to live on that wage.
So in the 9 months that you worked for the Homer News, doing 2 or 3 stories a day, had there been any stories that you've written that you've gotten any pushback from or negative feedback about?
It's interesting because the only stories that I felt like I got any negative feedback or pushback about was from more conservative members of the community that didn't feel like they were represented in Homer News coverage. And that had to do specifically with, I covered a lot of protests early on in the year with the No Kings protests and things that were going on with that. I had a lot of people that were organizing those rallies and protests and gatherings reach out directly to me and ask that I be there and that I cover those events. And I also really wanted to work on ramping up our social media presence because it had really fallen to the wayside and it's difficult to make money with print media these days. And I thought that social media would be a good way to increase our engagement. And my hope was to revitalize the Homer News' presence in the community because I felt like it had really fallen in recent years. Just as somebody that had grown up in that community and had seen what it used to be and had seen how that had been pulled back in recent years, I wanted to do anything that I could to try and support its continuation. And so part of that was revamping the social media. And so when I had been posting about some of the gatherings and the protests and the rallies earlier on in the year, we'd gotten a lot of social media comments or responses from people that were pretty negative about us covering those things at all. And also were expressing that they didn't feel like the Homer News was covering their events or stories that they felt were important. And so something that I had begun to do in response to that was try and bridge that gap. And it's difficult because, like I said, a lot of people that were hosting these events that were getting negative feedback were reaching out to me directly for me to cover them. And so I wasn't getting any of that from the people that were criticizing it. I wasn't getting any invitations to their events or outreach from them. It was just negative feedback I was receiving, and that's a little hard to work with. So I had started paying a lot more attention to different events at different areas in town that I thought maybe we were missing, or maybe that I could help bridge that gap. And for example, there was one weekend this summer where there was a Juneteenth celebration, a pride parade. I believe there was some form of a rally. And then there was also a Flag Day parade that was happening. And they were all happening within about 3, 4 hours of each other. And I was the only reporter that was available that day. It was just two reporters working in the newsroom at the time. It was myself and one other. And she was unavailable that day to cover any of the events. I took it upon myself and managed my hours that week so that I would be free and available, and went to Pride Parade and the Juneteenth celebration and the rally and took photos and videos there and wrote stories on that. And then I also went and posted out at the base of the Homer Spit and took photos and videos as well of the Flag Day Parade, and went to the VFW in Anchor Point after that to try and connect with people there as well. When I did receive any kind of feedback before this, my immediate response to that was to try and address it and meet that gap and take what people were saying into consideration and increase coverage, because that was my main concern. Again, I see journalism as just another way of serving communities and as that public service. And that was what I was trying to do there, but nothing to the level of what we ended up experiencing about a month ago.
Michael Armstrong, in his interview, talked about under previous ownership, I guess it was probably for the 2016 presidential election, that the properties were expected to write an op-ed endorsing Donald Trump, and that Homer News hadn't had to do it. But he was basically just offering that feedback that actually Homer News's ownership has historically leaned more conservative, and there actually had been some pressure to have a more right-leaning coverage. Did you ever experience any pressure to cover things in a certain way?
No, I did not. But honestly, the only people that I was really in communication with within the newspaper was my colleague that I worked directly with here in Homer and my editor, Aaron, who hired me. I had very little, if any, exposure to anybody above Aaron. And so it was just her that I was working with directly. And she never gave me any kind of pressure to be reporting for any political persuasion in particular. And coming from public radio newsrooms, which used to be at least somewhat publicly funded, that has just never been a conversation that was had with me about speaking to any particular political perspective within reporting. I also heard Michael talk about that in the episode that he did with you, and that was news to me. I had never heard about that. And as a community member in Homer at that time, I had no idea about anything like that. And I think that probably goes for a lot of people in Homer that they had no perspective of that.
One thing that Jake talked about in his interview was the lack of peers just to run things by. And I'm curious if you felt that you had more peer input back in Juneau at public radio than you did at the Homer News.
I do think because of the collaborative nature of public radio and the way that the network operates in Alaska, you do have a lot more of a framework for peer support and just perspectives than I think I had while working at the Homer News. But that does have to do, I think, also with just staff levels. There was only, I think, there was myself, my colleague at the Homer News that's still there, Jake, Aaron, and Jeff were really the only people that I was working with. And that was spread out over two papers, whereas I probably had twice as many people working with me when I was in Juneau. So I think that's just maybe a resources
Well,
matter. So I
bring it up.
guess yes would be the answer to your question. But
Yeah, I bring it up just because talking to journalists who were working at the Anchorage Daily News in the 80s, or even Fairbanks Daily News Miner in the 80s, or even the Juneau Empire in the 80s, they all talked about there being lots and lots of people around and lots of experienced reporters who would take a look at your piece and offer some suggestions, that there was a lot more opportunity for feedback than a new reporter working somewhere where there's one other newer reporter and y'all are both racing to meet these really difficult thresholds of 2 to 3 stories a day, that there's not that much time to read other people's stories and offer feedback.
yeah, I definitely felt like Erin was a very competent editor, and I always felt like she made time to talk with us and go through our things in detail. But I think that's, yeah, just an example of how journalism has changed, and it's become very unsustainable, it seems. And ideally, there would be a handful of reporters. I've looked through a lot of the older papers when I worked at Homer News. And yeah, looking at the staff list from 2005, even, there was a lot more people there.
I haven't interviewed Erin. I haven't really reached out to her, so I don't feel that comfortable talking about her workload. But the fact that she was editing both the Homer News and the Peninsula Clarion, but also the Juneau Empire, and what sort of workload that would be for a single editor to be overseeing 3 newspapers simultaneously.
Yeah, I think she might be able to speak a little bit better to that experience. I don't want to put any words in her
Mm.
mouth or anything, but if you can imagine starting a job and having that be your expectation for 40 hours a week, and then slowly having a whole other position's expectations put on you, and then a whole other expectations or level of expectation put on you from another position. It's difficult, but I always felt like Erin was really wonderful about making time to prioritize us and make sure that we had the support that we needed, even though she did have obviously a very large workload to be responsible for.
So that brings us towards September. It
Mhm.
sounds like that one of the reasons why you decided to cover the Charlie Kirk Memorial was because there had been some feedback that the Homer News needed to be at
Mhm.
more conservative events more often and to cover them. Can you talk a little bit about your decision to cover that in the first place?
Yeah. So that was a huge part of it, was that wanting to bridge that gap. Also, I stay abreast of everything that Sarah Vance does because she is our representative, and I think it's important to be aware of her actions on things as a reporter in one of her constituencies. And I've never really had the opportunity to interview her or speak directly with her. I did cover an event that she did. I forget exactly what month. It was earlier on this year, though, when she hosted a town hall meeting. And so I covered that. I just thought it was very important that I be at the Charlie Kirk Vigil, not only because of trying to bridge that gap that I saw and that was expressed to me. But also, it was important that I be there because I knew that there wasn't going to be a large amount of the population present at that event. And I was concerned that if I didn't go, that information might not be accessible to them. The things that were shared there, or I think it's important that representatives be held accountable to the things that they say. And I thought it was important that I be there to spread whatever she had to say, because obviously she was very passionate about it if she was helping co-host it. And so I went and took video, I took photos, I took audio. There was a lot of people there, and I thought that was just more proof of the fact that it was important that I was there. The day after the vigil, I also was hosting a candidate forum along with KBBI's news reporter for school board here for the borough, and it was directly the day after the vigil. And it was at the local Homer Public Library. And I had, I think, 3 or 4 people come up to me and express how thankful they were that I had been to the vigil and attended, and that they felt grateful that the Homer News was reaching out and trying to be representative and just being more inclusive to their perspectives. It sounded like what was expressed to me. And so there was a lot of positive feedback that I received before I released my story and before Sarah Vance released her letter. And so that was great to hear because that was what I was trying to do. I was trying to bridge that gap and make sure that everybody felt like their stories were being heard. I felt like I was on the right track with that. And even after I released my story online, that seemed like there was a lot of positive response. I posted the video of Representative Vance's full speech that she gave at the vigil, and there was a lot of contentious comments within that video. And I didn't expect it to be that contentious, and maybe that was naive of me, but it seemed like a lot of the people that were responding positively and were very happy to see that video be posted also responded positively to the story that I posted before the letter that Representative Vance wrote was released. So it was just interesting from a socio-political perspective, I think, to look at the ways the conversation changed once she released her letter and her perspective.
At the event itself, did you interact with Sarah Vance at all?
I did not. I got there pretty early. I didn't see her at first. I did speak with Cassie Laver, who was another co-organizer. So I didn't speak directly with Sarah at the event, but I did speak with other people that were there and gained a little bit of their perspectives and asked them how they had heard about Charlie Kirk, what their experience was, how they felt after his death, and how that had affected them. So it was a Wednesday, September 17th. That's when I went. And then I waited about almost a week before we released my story. I took a couple days to process it and also read other news sources in the language that they were using to talk about Charlie Kirk and the situation and the language that they were using and just the ways that other people were reporting on it. So I didn't publish anything until that Tuesday when Aaron and I worked on the story. And like I said, there was about almost 24 hours probably where it seemed like there was really positive response online. People that were more conservative or had been very excited about the video that I had posted seemed to be heart reacting and responding positively to the story that I had posted online on the web. And then I believe it was Wednesday evening that Representative Vance posted her letter, and that was when the conversation started to turn.
I'm curious if you're willing to share any particular coverage that you read that informed your willingness to be critical of Charlie Kirk early in the article that you wrote. If that was based on the way other publications were covering him, that made you feel like that was the way to go.
Yeah, I guess I didn't even really see what I wrote as being critical. First, I just Googled him and I wasn't familiar with most. I mean, I'd seen clips of his videos and things like that that he had posted on social media just in the last couple of years because I am on TikTok and social media and things like that, but wasn't terribly familiar with his platform or his more widespread beliefs or his work. And so I did a lot of research just into his background and how he got to where he was and the things that he was passionate talking about and some of his arguments and things like that. So I did some research into that. I did some research into stories that different major news publications had put out, like national news sources of various backgrounds, just to see the words that they were using to describe him and some of his beliefs. Actually, I linked one of those and my original that I
Mhm.
posted on the website, on the Homer News website, and I linked to a New York Times article that I thought most concisely showed evidence of some of those beliefs that I had referenced in the beginning of my story because it linked to, I believe, video clips or direct quotes that he had said.
Right.
So I thought that would be most useful for people to fact check things. I think references are so vital to any kind of storytelling or any kind of context providing. And so that's why I chose that source. And that was actually the hardest part of this entire situation for me was that when they went and edited that piece online, they removed that link. And in a way, I felt like that took away my reference. And that was very difficult for me because now, anyways, lots of reasons. But I
Well,
just
if
feel like
it's okay, just so listeners have a
Mhm.
full understanding of what we're talking about, do you have it in front of you? Do you want to read it?
I can pull it up if you'd like.
Okay.
I'll just read the first three paragraphs of the story that was published. This is the original before it was edited or removed. Hundreds of people gathered on the beach Wednesday, September 17th, to remember Charlie Kirk, who was shot and killed while holding a campus event in Utah for his organization Turning Point USA on September 10th. Kirk was a far-right political activist and Christian nationalist icon. He regularly toured college campuses across the country, engaging college students in debates where he defended his often racist and controversial views, including criticism of the Civil Rights Act and the work of Martin Luther King Jr., opposition to gun control and affirmative action, and his perpetuation of conspiracy theories, including COVID-19 and climate misinformation, as well as replacement theory. And then I went on to write, Kirk became civically engaged while still in high school, making his first appearance on Fox News at the age of 17 and co-founding Turning Point USA at 18 after dropping out of college. Turning Point produces resources for conservative students, including Professor Watchlist, a website created to, quote, expose and document college professors who discriminate against conservative students and advanced leftist propaganda in the classroom, end quote, and Turning Point Education, which supports a network of schools across the country that promote conservative Christian values. So those were the two main passages that I believe Representative Vance took issue with and that were later edited or changed.
I did talk to an experienced journalist who'd been around for 40 years who said that he felt those paragraphs should have come later in the story, that there was something a bit antagonistic about having them appear in the second sentence. That if this were a profile of Charlie Kirk, it would be one thing, but because it was about a memorial service, it felt more confrontational to have it up front. Do you disagree with what that journalist was saying?
Yeah, my intention was never to be antagonistic or to be perceived in that way. I was honestly astounded by the response that this piece got because I felt like my intentions were good. I think coming from a public radio background, especially, and this is something I've spoken to a couple of different editors or reporters that have also had very long careers in journalism and have said a similar comment or criticism that they would have rearranged it or maybe put it towards the bottom if they were editing that piece. When you're writing for public radio, there's somewhat of an intention to keep people listening or to provide a context very early on before you delve deeper into stories. I could see perhaps maybe there being a difference in print to public radio stories where maybe I've just been so used to reading and writing for 6 years radio-based stories that maybe that's how I approach storytelling in general, and it just didn't seem odd to me, or I didn't think to put that near the end. But yeah, my intention was never to be antagonistic or to be inappropriate in any kind of reporting that I was doing. Obviously, it was a vigil, it was a memorial for somebody that had died, and I took that very seriously. And I was very touched by a lot of what I saw at the vigil. And as somebody that loves and values all people within my community, it was hard to see people be distraught over this when I was there. And obviously, there were people that cared deeply about it and expressed that to me. And so it was not my intention to hurt those people or make those people feel as if I had some kind of malicious intent or ulterior motive or intention to speak badly of somebody that wasn't able to defend themselves. My intention was just to provide a little context for who he was and the things that he believed in, because I also saw that from a journalistic view as part of the reason why he was murdered, because that was something that was given as an example by the person that is his alleged murderer. And so that seemed like important context to me. And that seemed to be something that was on the minds of a lot of people at the vigil as well. This idea that people can be violently persecuted for just speaking what they believed in. And that seemed to frighten a lot of people that were there at the vigil. And I thought that was an important piece of it that needed to be acknowledged. And again, maybe it comes from that public radio history of kind of front loading things, but it was not intentional by any means.
And Jake alluded to it in his interview that he was sure that probably you and Aaron had conversations about this language. Did you guys talk about it?
Yeah, my story draft that I gave Erin, I believe, was probably twice as long as the one that actually was sent out. And how that works, we talk on the phone, we message, we email. She gives me feedback within the document that we operate with. So, yeah, we had several conversations both about how to approach coverage of the event and all of that. I trusted Erin. I still trust Erin. And I felt as if anything that she approved and that I had written, I felt confident about putting out there. And again, maybe that was naive because I hadn't really received anything like this in the form of feedback before that we experienced with this piece. But yeah, I felt confident in both of our abilities.
You said that like when it was first up, you felt like things were going well. I guess talk us through the next couple of days and how you experienced it, from the removal of the story to reposting it without your byline. Just talk us through that.
Yeah. It really did seem just another day, just another paper that we were putting out, just another story I had written. And again, the feedback seemed positive online to the story when I originally posted it on Tuesday. And then Wednesday afternoon, I was preparing to go host another candidate forum. This one was for city council members. And I had a friend from high school that I used to do debate with text me a link to a Facebook post. And I went and I looked, and it was the post that Sarah Vance had put out. And I read it and was very surprised, just again, because I had not expected that kind of feedback or that kind of response. And then pretty much immediately after seeing that, had to go to the Homer Public Library to host that candidate forum that was
Right.
going
You
to be
just kind of
broadcast
see
and
it and move
covered.
on. Yeah.
Yep, I had to see it, try and process it a little bit, and then go be in a very public position.
That
Yeah.
initial Facebook post that Sarah Vance said that your piece was not journalism, but rather, quote, hate baiting at its worst, end quote. And she asked the owners of Carpenter Media Group, who own the Homer News, to take immediate corrective action. So basically saying this is not journalism, this is hate baiting, this is absolute bias, take immediate action. So you saw that, and then you showed up at the candidate forum.
Yep. I had to just go do my job. And it was frightening because even at that time early on, it had only been up for a few hours or had just been posted. And I could already see Facebook comments rolling in and people agreeing with her and out for blood. It was just a little frightening to read some of the comments on there. And so to have to go and be in a very public setting was a little daunting after that. But I went, I did it. And my colleague Jake was actually coming down from Kenai to help us co-host that. So that was nice to have that kind of in-person support. And I was a little concerned because the week before, as I had said, people had come up and approached me and said how thankful they were that I had been at the vigil, and that had been at the forum the week before. And so I was a little concerned that maybe I would have an opposite reaction and people might come and be angry or try and have some kind of conversation with me about that I wasn't ready to have at that time because I was, again, just a little blindsided by it. And so, yeah, that was Wednesday night. And I did the forum. I went home, spent the night with my family at their house with my dog. And then the next day was Thursday. And that same night, there was some communication online I believe. Did Michael talk to you about the letters that he was sending?
He did. In
Okay.
fact, I believe he sent me what he sent to Sarah Vance.
Okay.
Not only that, but I actually texted with Sarah Vance about it.
Okay. Yeah, so Michael, I believe that night, Wednesday night, sent an email to Sarah Vance, but also CC'd or sent it to the people that she had sent her letter to within Carpenter Media Management. And he included myself and I believe Aaron on that as well. And so that went out Wednesday night. And then Thursday morning, one of the people, I can't remember which one of the two men that Sarah had addressed her letter to, emailed us back in response to Michael's letter and said he was going to forward it to Mary Kimmis, who was the person in charge of the Alaska branch of Carpenter, is my understanding. And so that was Thursday morning, and I'm still just trying to process things as things are happening, trying not to be on social media too much, because even
And while this
on
is happening,
Thursday,
the paper version of the paper is arriving at people's doors.
right, this is Thursday morning, so the paper has gone out and people can purchase it. It's on newsstands in Homer, and that has, of course, my original story in it published. And so Thursday morning was just a blur. And then at some point, I think in the early afternoon, it occurs to me because I'm starting to see, I'm tracking social media and seeing the conversations that are happening around this. And it occurs to me that maybe I need to go and take some photos and screenshots of my original story because I start to become concerned that this could be escalating into something. And I'm not sure what, but I figure it would be good to have a concrete example of what the original story was and what I said. And I go online to find it, and I click on the link through the Facebook page, our Facebook page, and it says, "Oops, page not found." And I text Erin and I said, "Hey, did you take this down? I understand if you did, but I wish we could have a conversation about it. What's up? Can we talk? Can you call me?" And she was totally blindsided as well. She had not done it herself. She said that someone within Carpenter Media Management had asked her for a link to the story that morning. And so she had sent the link to the story on the Homer News website. And they had, we guessed at some point between her sending the link and me looking, removed it completely from the web. Yep. So then at that point, it's just Sarah Vance's word out there, and there's no way for anybody to actually see what I wrote or what I said or see the reference that I cited. It's just like this gap of source and then whatever Sarah Vance had to say. So that was frightening to me as a reporter and as somebody that she names directly in that. So that was Thursday, early afternoon, maybe late morning. And then I believe it was later that day that they reposted the story, but it was edited and there was no editor's note, which is
Right. Very unusual.
very unusual. And it was all done without any word to me or Aaron. So, yeah.
Did you work on Friday like a normal work day?
I was working. I don't think I was putting out two stories those days though. But yeah, I was working. I was in the office or clocked in. I was trying to follow up on stories. Even up to the day that we put our resignation in, I was interviewing people. I was planning stories. I fully intended to serve out the 2 weeks that we had given when we put in our resignation.
Since Homer is a smaller town and you grew up there, I assume that some of the people writing nasty comments on social media, it's not like these are strangers, but these are actually people that you know their name in public, they know who you are. Is that
Yeah.
true or not true?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think my first response that I had after reading the post that she had made and seeing that she had named me directly was I texted my dad, who works in construction locally. And I texted him and I just said, "Dad, I am so sorry if this affects you. Like, what happened?" And he was like, "What are you talking about? What happened? Are you okay?" And I kind of like sent him the link and let him look at it. He works with more conservative people, or the construction community is somewhat conservative here in Homer. It's an interesting community to navigate in at times. But again, I've never experienced anything like this. And I think part of that is because I worked in coffee for a long time. I was a specialty coffee barista. And so that's the other aspect that I think has actually really helped me in doing journalism here in Homer is that you know everybody because you've made their coffee for years and they feel comfortable and safe talking to you. But yeah, I mean, it was disheartening, I think, especially because I could recognize names and I'd think, oh, that's so and so's parent that I went to school with, or that's like my landlord actually was liking and laugh reacting. She liked the original posts and she was laugh reacting to people defending me. That really made me pause and was difficult to see too because it's been an interesting thing to navigate, I think, emotionally and also socially because it is such a small community. It's about between 5,200 and 6,000 people that live here and around Homer.
Has anyone treated you poorly as you go about your day, go grocery shopping or whatever?
It is kind of like a running joke in Homer that you can't go to Safeway without seeing like everybody from high school or things like that. So the first thing I actually did when all of this started was go to Safeway and stock up on food and things because I didn't necessarily want to be going out and about as much as I might have otherwise. So to be honest, I've tried to avoid situations like that and the fear that they might happen, just because there is a certain level of anonymity that you get as a public radio host that
Mhm.
I feel like I haven't had, both reporting in the community that I grew up in and also I was in person at the vigil. Everybody saw my face. I'm sure everybody knew who I was because I was the girl holding a cell phone at the front of the crowd taking video. And so I felt very seen and perceived when I was at the vigil. And I guess there's a certain level of awareness and trepidation that I've had about having encounters like that. So I've somewhat avoided going to Safeway or going into very public places since this has all happened. And again, it's only been about a month and things have definitely calmed down, but just in those first couple of weeks where it seemed like the social media was so divided, and social media is just very difficult because of all the things that everybody's aware of. It removes that culpability, it removes that ability of people to have human connections or look in the eyes of the person that they're saying things about. And it, I think, removes a certain level of humanity to social interactions. And so I don't know that I would have as intense of interactions with people as I feel like they were perpetrating on social media, but that was definitely a consideration that I had and something that I was trying to avoid. Yeah.
There was a free speech rally held shortly after.
A
But you
lot of
attended,
things
I
involved.
assume.
I did not attend.
You did not attend.
I was going to, but I ended up not.
Out of safety
But I had
considerations?
partially, yes. Yeah, that was part of it. I also there have been a few different things that I have declined being involved in, but have been offered opportunities to be involved in, just because I do feel like, even with everything that Representative Vance has said about me and about my reporting, I do think that there should be a division somewhat between, definitely a division between a reporter and politics. And so if I was going to continue on in journalism and reporting, I wanted to try and maintain somewhat of an unbiased or unpolitical stance. There's been a lot of support for me within the community from a lot of people, and I just didn't want to make it all about me. And I worried that would potentially be a big focus if I went to that rally. And I also didn't want to have to speak because I was still processing a lot of things. And yeah, there was multiple reasons why I thought it would be best if I didn't attend. But I did have one of my very close friends attend for me, and she spoke a little on my behalf and brought me a couple pages of notes from different community members that had written in support and just sweet things that they had said. But I didn't really feel like it would have been appropriate for me to attend.
I have covered some aspects of the new federal administration, specifically Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth's, where he invited all the generals from around the world to come hear him and President Trump speak at Quantico. And I bring that up because he investigated over 300 soldiers who had posted something negative about Charlie Kirk. And it just seems an unusual thing in our country where we have freedom of speech and freedom of the press, that there seems to be a gag order about this particular person. And it may not just be this person in the future. And I don't know how comfortable you feel speaking about it, but my guess is that if you had written the exact same article about somebody else, that maybe all of this wouldn't have happened. And I don't know if you can speak to that or disagree with that or have any input at all.
I think it goes a little bit back to just my belief that I really did not feel like I had written anything unfactual or untruthful. I actually thought that Representative Vance would appreciate that I had mentioned that he was a Christian nationalist icon, just because my understanding of some of her policy involvement is that she is involved with some Christian nationalist associations, and maybe I need to fact check myself on that, but that was my understanding from reporting within the community. So I actually thought that a lot of the language that I had used was something that they would be not excited by, but that they wouldn't have an issue with it. And so I do think that it is very interesting to consider the dialogues that have happened in the weeks since Charlie Kirk's death. I think it is unlike anything that I've really seen before operating in journalism, and does seem like there is a lot of irony underlacing a lot of it that I don't know if everybody is necessarily aware of. But yeah, I don't know what the response would have been like if I had written a piece about somebody else and called them a far left person or devote agnostic, or yeah, I'm not quite sure what the response to that would have been, but I can say that I was very surprised by the response to this, and that it was not my intention to create any kind of negativity. It was actually the opposite intention. It was to try and bridge that and try and support those voices and give them an outlet to be seen and heard. I do stand by what I put in that story. And yeah, it's just been a very interesting thing to navigate. And it's definitely provoked a lot of deeper thought on my level.
She is the Alaska state chair for the National Association of Christian Lawmakers. And I'm just glancing at their website, trying to see. They don't use the word Christian nationalist. And I had asked Michael if he thought that Christian nationalist was a negative term. And I think it does vary from person to person as to whether or not the word Christian nationalist is derogatory. I don't know.
I certainly didn't think of it as a derogatory term when I used it. I just thought of it as an identifier to as like a group of people and their beliefs. And again, maybe I need to do more research into it, but that was my understanding of it as a political scientist and as a community member that is in her constituency. I didn't mean it in a derogatory way. I did not believe that Representative Vance would have an issue with that.
I appreciate you wanting to remain nonpartisan for your future in journalism, but that we're really carefully trying to decide what language can and can't be used to describe a person. Whereas President Donald Trump, in a Truth Social post, called Democrats, quote, the party of hate, evil, and Satan, end quote. And I don't know. I just don't see a lot of people like splicing the language to see, is calling Democrats the party of hate, evil, and Satan derogatory? It's like absurd that somehow like we're like laboring over the exact right language and not wanting to be antagonistic when we have the president being as antagonistic as possible.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting that she used the term hate baiting to refer to what I was reporting, when what she was referencing was truthful, factual things, and what I had written and looked at and sourced and seen video evidence of quotes. And I feel like I wasn't trying to pass judgment with those passages. I was just trying to provide a little context. And so it's interesting to me to see her label that as hate baiting when it was just referencing things that he had said or done. There's a lot of irony to it. It's a very layered issue, but I'm hopeful that there will continue to be immersive reporting, reporters that will continue to hopefully tell these stories. And I saw a lot of reporting done both about our resignations or about the story that I put out, And it was a little ironic to me because either part of or most of the story that the people had put out was almost verbatim the story that I had put out, just as far as the vigil itself. And the realization that if I hadn't been there, there was a high likelihood that story never would have been put out, that there would have been no conversation around what was spoken about at that vigil. And a huge component of what was spoken about at that vigil and what really was interesting to me was that there's a Turning Point Education School opening here in Homer. And that was huge. I had not heard anything about that. And I was very interested to hear that and wanted to follow up on that, wanted to learn more. They mentioned it being one of 11 in the entire United States. And maybe that number, I'm guessing it has grown since then, just because of all of the renewed interest in getting involved with that platform since his passing. But to hear that one of 11 Turning Point Education schools was going to be opening in my community that I was born and raised in was fascinating to me, both as a community member and a reporter. And that was something I heard reflected back from a lot of community members that they had no idea about that and that they were very interested in it.
Do you have any update on that Turning Point school? Is it moving forward?
I have no idea other than what was shared during the vigil. I haven't followed up with anybody. My understanding of it from attending the vigil and hearing Miss Cushway speak was that it's opening next year at some point. I think their hope is next fall in 2026. And I think they said something, I'd have to double check my notes, but I believe they said they have about 100 interested prospective students.
Is it called Revive Academy?
Revive Academy is, I believe, the name that they've chosen. And it should be online.
What are you doing now?
Yeah, so before we resigned, I had also been working somewhat part-time with the local land trust here in Homer. And so I've been working with them doing some contract development work. And so that's been keeping me distracted and busy in this interim period while I figure out what my next steps are professionally. And that's just through December. I have a little bit of time. And I've done a couple different reporting things since all of this happened. I've worked a little bit with KBBI here in Homer. I've worked a little bit with the Alaska Current. So things are a little in flux right now, and it's only been, I think, just now over a month since this all kind of exploded. So there is still a lot of processing, I think, that needs to be done about all of it before I decide exactly what I'm going to do next.
Any last thing that you want to tell listeners?
I don't know. I just hope that, if anything, this issue that we've experienced, this situation that we're going through, I hope it makes people more aware of both their existing local news structures and the people that represent them. I think it's very easy to take local media for granted, but it is something that is really struggling in Alaska especially, but also nationwide. Journalists struggle with very high rates of burnout, and I'm sure you've heard lots of stories of that through your experience interviewing different journalists for this podcast. But I think it's just important for people to recognize and support the reporters in their communities because it's not an easy job, and they do face a lot of judgment and a lot of hurdles for not a lot of pay. But that's because a lot of them aren't in it for money. I'm certainly not in it for money. I'm in it because I feel like these stories are important, and I feel like they're vital for us to make decisions as constituents and as community members. And so, yeah, I hope that the people are paying attention to not only the things that reporters are reporting, but also to the news environments that those reporters are working in, because that, at the end of the day, that's how you continue to get reliable local news that is unbiased and fair reporting, is by supporting the retention of these local community reporters. It takes a long time for somebody coming from outside to integrate into a community and understand the nuance and meet people and know who to call. And it's communities benefit from retaining their reporters. And I just think that's important for people to consider, and maybe something that they don't think about if they're not actively involved in newscapes or in news communities. I also hope that someday journalists
pays a living wage.
Yes, exactly. That they can be supported in that kind of pursuit of public service journalism. And I think that's important. And I think that those jobs do exist out there. And it's just about building the frameworks within communities to support them. And I think some communities value those opportunities a little bit more than others. But I think every community should value them.
Do you know
Yeah.
what the status of the Homer News is right now? Or were they able to hire someone to replace you? Are they able to keep their Thursday paper coming out?
To be honest, I have not been paying too much attention to the Homer News since my leaving. I do know that there is one remaining reporter there, my former colleague, who has stayed on. I'm not sure if they've hired anybody to replace my position. It's very difficult to find people to move to these small of communities, I imagine, paying what they are paying. But I have not received any kind of update. I have heard since my leaving dozens of people telling me that they've canceled their subscription because they don't want to support the Homer News because of what went down and the way that they reacted to editing my article. I've heard of advertisers that have said that they will no longer be advertising with them. I've heard of outlets that have newsstands and that sell the newspaper telling me that they're no longer going to be selling the newspaper through their business and that they are in the process of switching their advertisement funding to KBBI, the local public radio station, which has been struggling with funding ever since federal cuts and state cuts a few years ago. And so there's definitely been this interesting shift locally that I don't think is necessarily what Representative Vance was suggesting within their letter and was actually in response to her letter. It's interesting for me to consider thinking about what Carpenter's response is perhaps to this and whether or not they perceive that to be verifying what Representative Vance was saying, or if they recognize that has to do with people that are unpleased with their behavior and don't want to support out-of-state ownership of a community resource. And I have heard from a few other people that there's at least one other news source that is in the process of being created down here in Homer, but it's in the very early stages. It sounds like, I believe it's hoped to be a non-profit newsroom, but I am not involved in any way in the creation of that. So hopefully that will come to fruition because it sounds like a lot of people have lost faith in the Homer News because of this incident, which is hard to see as somebody that grew up loving the Homer News, reading Michael's reporting, and just really valued it as a community asset. That's definitely been a difficult thing for me to navigate. And it's hard for a lot of people too. People have expressed not knowing what to do and whether or not they should cancel because of their ethical beliefs on this or support it because they don't want to lose journalism in this community. It's definitely a nuanced issue, and I think it's something that a lot of people have had to confront, and a lot of people have had conversations with me about just not knowing what to do or what to think about it. It's been an interesting community conversation to be a part of.
Chloe Pleznac, thank you so much for being on the show today, and I wish you the best of luck in whatever your future endeavors happen to be.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.